Yep, time for John to tell us about Van Halen.
Absolutely. So I believe, Josh, in the opener, we heard Panama, correct?
Correct.
And now you are going to hear I'll Wait.
I am your picture, yes, I know it well. Another page is turned. Are you for real? It's so hard to tell from just a magazine. Yeah, you just smiled and the picture sells. Look what that does to me. I'll wait till your love comes down. I'm coming straight for your heart. No way you can stop me now. As fine as you are.
So Van Halen did not discover synths on this album, but certainly this is the biggest example of synths. They'd been layering them into albums since Women and Children first. Eddie was the one who really wanted the synths. It was when I'm going to go to the numbers in a second here too, but I'll finish this story. The numbers can wait for a second as I finish this story. So it was really David Lee Roth and Eddie, one of their big battles, and actually that kind of led to the dissolution of the band. They had different views of the band, but one of them was that Eddie had long been agitating to put synths on, and David Lee Roth did not like that. He wanted them to stay more of the classic Van Halen sound. And I guess Diver Down was the breaking point. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but just so you know. Matt, go ahead and run the numbers.
So 1984 by Van Halen comes in at number 132 in the 1980s on Best Ever Albums. Number 16 in 1984. Number 870 of all time. And it's not on Rolling Stone's list. But it did come in at number the Van Halen's second highest rated album on Best Ever Albums, behind their 1978 release Van Halen, self-titled album. And Van Halen comes in at number 199 in overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums, so just cracking the top 200.
Gotcha. Well, it's interesting because we covered Van Halen's first album, and now we're going to do, well, I was going to say Van Halen's last album with David Lee Roth, but it isn't, because they did Different Kind of Truth, I think, in 2012. So they do one later. But I will say this is the last album of the vintage Van Halen lineup, because Mike Anthony sticks around through the Hagar and Sharon eras, but David Lee Roth doesn't come until the album after Mike Anthony is gone and replaced by Wolfgang, Eddie's son, on the bass. So yeah, this is the last classic era Van Halen album. Recorded January 9, 1984. Unlike all of Van Halen's other albums, which took about 2 to 3 weeks to record, this one was sort of over the course of a year, but really formally the most work was done from June to October of 1983. It was recorded in 5150 Studios, which is in Studio City, California. Perfect place to have a Studio City. And it is 5150 Studios is the studio that Eddie Van Halen built. It is his studio. So he, and we'll talk about why he built it, because it's important to understand this, but the 5150 and later it was also a Van Halen band name as well, or excuse me, album name. In the Hagar era. 5150. And the 5150 was a code from the California Welfare and Institutions Agency. And it was basically a code that was used when a officer or clinician could basically, involuntarily hold someone for psychiatric. I think they call it, in my line of work, an emergency petition is what that's called nowadays. But basically an involuntary psychiatric hold because of danger to self or others in a thing. So that's what 5150 meant. So I guess that gives us an idea of Eddie's state of mind. Right there. Van Halen produced 4 singles, and Jump hits number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album got as high as number 2, where it spent, I believe, 5 weeks. 5 weeks behind Michael Jackson Thriller. which is interesting because obviously Eddie played on Beat It, so he was a part of tracks on both of those two albums. The album is certified diamond by the Recording Industry Association of America, which signifies 10 million copies sold. So there you go. The singles on this I don't think are hard to guess. They're Jump, Panama, I'll Wait, and Hot for Teacher. Kind of 4 big greatest hits type Van Halen songs. But let's take a trip back, guys, and talk about very quickly after Van Halen 1, which was 77. Van Halen 2 comes out it was 78. Van Halen 2 comes out a year later. Then there's Women and Children First in 80. And Fair Warning in 81. And during this time, they're basically churning out these albums and touring. And so after Fair Warning, the plan was to take a break. But at this time, the record label wanted another album to keep the machine going, as you might imagine. And sort of there was a negotiation a little bit where it was sort of Eddie against David Lee Roth and Ted Templeman, who was the producer for the Van Halen albums. And in that album, Diver Down, David Lee Roth and Ted Templeman win. And so Diver Down is mostly covers, but there's a few original songs on there as well. But it definitely has more of a Dave vibe to it, I think. I don't know if you guys have heard that one before, but it definitely feels like a Dave album. And,
yeah, I've heard it. It hasn't been. It's been a while though.
Yeah. So after that, Eddie kind of was not loving it. He wanted to make a keyboard-driven album, and so he decides to build the studio 5150, and he's just getting soundboards, tape machines, synthesizers brought in. And he just sort of starts fiddling around without any real plan on the synthesizers, just messing around. So I think it was mentioned in one quote I saw that there were no presets. He just sort of mad scientist did it in there. And the idea behind the studio was that Eddie Van Halen kind of wanted to do his own thing and not feel like he had to have interference in his mind. There was interference by David Lee Roth and Templeman, right? So he's in there fiddling away. And I think 1984 is often called the result of a meld between what David Lee Roth and Templeman wanted and what Eddie wanted. And it sort of was the David Lee Roth mixed with the Eddie vision at that time. And I think most famously when Roth leaves, right, in 1985, that, Hagar era very much is the Eddie Van Halen idea, where he wanted the band to sound, right? And so 84 isn't all the way there because I think there still is, in the playing of Michael Anthony and Alex Van Halen, classic Van Halen oomph in it, and of course the vision of it is more of a rock band. But yeah, this one definitely sounds different, as I'm sure we'll talk about. But it's going across the board. Some of these tracks, Eddie had been working on bits and pieces of it since about 1982. I think famously, Eddie had a lot of the skeleton of Jump, and then David Lee Roth wouldn't write lyrics over it. He didn't like it, and then finally one day he's like, all right, I'll write lyrics for it. And I know in his book he claims that he was watching TV and he saw somebody contemplating whether to jump, but it doesn't really line up with what I think the lyrics are like, kind of. Yeah. So it's an interesting take there. But that's a little bit of the oversight going in. Obviously, tensions were high with the band during this time. They would stay together for a year after this and David Lee Roth would actually record a solo album, Crazy from the Heat, while still in the band. But eventually he breaks off from the band in 1985, midway through that year, and they hire Sammy Hagar from the band Montrose shortly after that, and embark on what some call the Van Hagar era, or Act 2 of Van Halen. And to stay with the theme we talked about of bands getting older, I guess there are some Van Hagar partialists, but I would use them as a classic example of what we were talking about before, of band getting older and kind of losing some of their je ne sais quoi, if we will. But that's a little bit of an overview. I'll throw in some facts along the way. Let's start with Josh. What are your thoughts on 1984 by Van Halen?
Yeah, so it's just like Van Halen 1, it's a album that I'm familiar with, but it had been a while since I listened to it, and it was interesting, as we've said before, going through the years chronologically. It was an interesting perspective hearing kind of where this album was at, being in 84 with all the synths that were on it, and then comparing it and thinking about how different it was from their first album that we covered. And it also occurred to me that we, even though this isn't technically the last Van Halen album, it is interesting that we did first and last with David Lee Roth, from that standpoint too. I don't think we've done that before. But this album is really fun. I really enjoyed listening to it. I mean, they fully embraced the synths, that's for sure. That stuck out to me first and foremost, and that's quite a departure from Van Halen 1 at least. And then the other thing I really noticed this time was Alex Van Halen's drumming is really good. I think we mentioned that in the first one, but it seemed to be it popped out to me this time listening. He's very tight. He keeps everything in tempo and in sync with the band, and it's a. You're gonna say something? I feel like you're gonna jump in. Oh, okay.
No.
Yeah.
I would say he's in the pocket, but I wasn't gonna say that. But I'll just jump in.
Yeah, and then but you still have Eddie Van Halen's guitar solos throughout, especially on Jump, and there's a drum solo too on Hot for Teacher to start it, which I really liked. And the other thing I noticed too this time around was kind of how they are still kind of a blues-based band, despite all their kind of antics and guitar wizardry and things like that. On a song like Drop Dead Legs, the opening riff could be a Led Zeppelin song if you didn't know any better, or if you weren't paying attention. And then even on something like House of Pain, the last track on the album, that's kind of blues based also. So I think that DNA is still there in in this album, but it's definitely like mid 80s with all the synth and the and like you said too, John, I noticed that kind of Roth is kind of dialed back, I feel like, on some of this album. He's not as, or at least he's not as like energetic as I feel like he was on some of the earlier albums. I noticed that as well, but I really like this album. I mean, at like 30 minutes and change, how could you not? It flies by. It's just so fun to listen to, and it really gets your spirits up if you haven't listened to it. And definitely check out all those middle albums as well, because they're all really good also. But yeah, thumbs up for me. I think I will say I think I like the first album more. I think it's just kind of like harder guitar, and not really, I like that sound more, but this is a fun album.
Yeah, this was interesting because I knew this. My brother had this album on tape, and so, but my experience listening to it was basically just the beginning, the first three songs, and I knew Hot for Teacher as well, and I mean the singles on this are insanely good. Like it's some of the best stuff that Van Halen has done. That, and I think Panama might be my favorite Van Halen song. Just that opening guitar riff. It's and how like in the middle part where David Lee Roth does his like I reach back between my legs, and then they build the song back up again, and then they kick right back into the chorus. It's just so good. It's just a great, powerful, catchy, like
it's got such
hard
a punch
rock song.
to it.
Yeah, it's a fantastic. That was the song I walked out. It was my walkout song at my wedding. It was like we're gonna walk out to Panama, So and Jump is just a classic song as well. It's definitely kind of it's more of a poppy song than a lot of the other Van Halen stuff. But I don't mind it at all. If you want to throw synths, if you want to be a hard rock band and throw synths into what you're doing, do it like Jump, because there's a reason why that's got a umpteen bajillion, listens to, because it's a universally great song. And then Hot for Teacher, man, Josh, that drum, I listened to the beginning of the drums there, and I'm like, is that just one take of him playing all that? Because it's ridiculously fast, and it doesn't sound like one person could be making all of those.
Have you ever watched him play it? It's pretty cool, actually. He's just hammering the hi-hat and like the pedal. It's just,
he's got to have double
awesome.
pedals on that. It's just it's so fast.
Does,
It's like it's insane, and it's like, wow, and that's got a great that's a faster song, and it's got a great guitar riff on it. That's just a great. You're right, Josh. There is a lot of blues-based stuff going on here, and that just, I don't know, the speed that they play that song, it just kicks it up a different level. And then I can't think of that without that's an iconic video. I can't listen to that song and not think of like what's going on in the video, and like it makes it laugh. I don't feel tardy. It just makes you laugh, So. All that stuff is really, really good. So but the rest of it was kind of stuff that I wasn't that familiar with. And I was kind of mixed on the rest of it, really. I thought that Top Jimmy and Drop Dead Legs, they were okay. They kind of started veering a little bit, not fully, but there was a little bit of generic kind of blues, classic rock, realms that those were going in. Not to the point where I was like, ugh, like it's just boring or whatever. And I think I did end up liking them more as the week went on and as I was listening to them more. But they definitely didn't carry as much punch as some of those other songs. I'll Wait was an interesting tune. I did like that one. And Girl Gone Bad, oh my God. Did you guys, all right, so I had to play this for Sherry tonight. And like, who does this, like the beginning of that song, to me, it was very clear who that sounded like. Did you guys pick up on at all, like a band that we've covered a couple of times? Am I the only one?
Rush?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It was very Rush. Like it was like almost a prog beginning, in the way that not just the key, not just the synths, but also the guitar, like just the very structure of that song at the very beginning. I was like, this is a freaking Rush song. So that kind of jolted it up a little bit. I thought that was interesting, kind of tune. And I liked House of Pain at the end. That's another good, rock song. So I think overall, I'm high on this. I do like it. I think probably their debut album, I agree with you, Josh. I think I like that overall as a whole better. I think it's maybe a little bit more consistent, but the highs on here, I don't think you're going to get much higher. God, there's some pretty big highs on the debut album as well. So
I think these hits are probably more well known.
This is where they were huge.
This was on regular. Who you're talking about. If you're talking about classic rock radio, or are you talking about with the general public?
I'm talking about mass appeal. This was on
general
MTV.
Public, yes.
But
classic rock radio, you hear. You talk about Love and Running with the Devil way more than you hear Panama and Jump.
Yeah. No, I'm talking like, because as 1984, I was 6, you know what I mean? So like, and this was just omnipresent, for a couple of years around then. So, so those are the ones that stand out. But I did enjoy the kind of the deeper cuts overall as a whole. But they were definitely for me several rungs below like the top songs on this, as well as some of the top songs on their debut album. But, a lot of fun. It's Van Halen kicks a punch, and they got the melody. I found it interesting talking about the synths, that this is a synth album. And really, I'm only counting, 4 songs on here, and that includes the opening instrumental, 1984, which is just over a minute long, as having synths. The majority of the songs on here do not have synths, and it's very much based in rock.
It's a 50-50 mix, like we talked about. Some of the songs are the Eddie songs, and some of the songs are the David. Top Jimmy is a David Lee Roth song, Jump
I think
is an Eddie song.
But I just it's definitely more. I would say it's even leaning more towards rock than the synths, because just the number of minutes that occupy each genre, each lane. So, but still, I liked both of them. I thought it was a good mix, and I'm a thumbs up.
Yeah, I think I'm higher on this than you guys are, man. This is one of the better albums. This is one of the better albums of the '80s. It's there's Jump isn't just a great rock. It's like the pop rock song. It's like almost like the lane of how you can do a rock song and also make it completely pop confectionery stuff. Although Panama is also in the top 5 of that lane as well.
Yeah.
I like how you guys just described the Hot for Teacher drum solo as like a drum solo. It's like one of the drum solos in rock music.
Okay.
Like it's literally what defines, you know, that sound. It's probably Eddie or Alex Van Halen. It's probably like the thing where just about everybody who hadn't figured it out was like, oh my God, this guy can really play, right?
Yeah.
I'd argue Girl Gone Bad and House of Pain are good illustrations of how underrated the rhythm section of Van Halen is, and also why it was so weird that they sort of just minimized Mike Anthony, because between his background singing and, you know, he's a pretty good bassist as well. But yeah, Girl Gone Bad and House of Pain, those songs have always been rhythm section songs for me with Van Halen. They really show that off, and Eddie's doing some pretty awesome guitar work all throughout this album too. He's got very interesting solos on this album that he weaves in. I'll Wait, written by Michael McDonald, by the way, I'd like to point out.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, different synthesizer than the rest of the album. The synthesizer that you certainly can recognize as the synthesizer he starts using in the Van Hagar era, because it sounds like Dreams and things like that, much more than the synth from Jump and 1984 does, right, which is a different one. And yeah, I mean, you've got some classic David Lee Roths in here too. I love how, like, nice white teeth on Drop Dead Legs always makes me laugh. He's describing the woman. It's like big old butt, like Drop Dead Legs, and like nice white teeth. And he says it with like a little bit of edge. It's like, yeah, just throw that in. It's kind of like almost like, you know, you're semi good looking, right? Like in Talk About Love. So there's always a lot of that. And that like cabaret lounge singery thing that David Lee Roth loves to do too, it seems like shows up, is present on Top Jimmy, which is like a 1950s song but funneled through Van Halen, you know, which always kind of cracks me up. So yeah, I know what you're saying, Matt, that like Top Jimmy and Drop Dead Legs suffer a little bit compared to the rest of like the big hits because it's just buffered in between all of these big hits. But I think Girl Gone Bad and House of Pain stay right up in peak choice territory, and that might be where I disagree with you, because they may not be as well known, but there's a lot on those where I'm like, this is an excellent song. And it's funny because it's such a different, even though you identify it as Van Halen, this is such a different album than Van Halen 1 is in some ways. It's you know, you could, I think of those people that like do reaction videos, you know, and they just randomly pick songs, and, you know, they could take like Running with the Devil and stuff like that, and then they come to this one and they Panama, and they would probably not even process that it's the same band in some ways. And that's the good thing about a great band. They have iconic songs across genres. So it just really, Van Halen is a lean, mean, tight machine, right, in terms of making albums, and they get in, they get out, like, definition of in no way overstaying their welcome. There's no fat on this album at all. Even the stuff that's being defined as filler is only filler in the loosest sense of the word. It's, you know, Van Halen always is. I remember somebody saying, like, Van Halen is like partying music and it's wash your car music, and like that's absolutely in a good way though, not in like a generic way. And it's, you know, it just puts you in a good mood instantaneously. And there's rarely been a band where the pieces are so dichotomous but come together so well. Like, just even looking at them, they just look completely different, right? Like, David Lee Roth looks so different than Eddie. And then you got, like, Mike Anthony, who just looks, you know, like, just of a different, like, friend group, kind of. Then it's a fascinating band dynamic. There's few bands that visually both fit great with each other but don't fit if you don't process how they sound less, and that's kind of how I describe, you know, kind of like all the Beatles fit together, right? You know, to some degree, you know, most bands, right, the guys fit together, but Van Halen I always felt like is these loose parts being driven together. That would be a good essential question, like, what are the most, you know, mixed up looking bands in like music history? But so yeah, incredibly high thumbs up for me. This is a great album. I you know, it's certainly almost a perfect way for the David Lee Roth era of Van Halen to end, because it really is sort of the chef's kiss of the David Lee Roth vision of Van Halen mixed with the Eddie version of Van Halen coming together syncretically for pretty much a perfect album for both in it's timeless and also perfect for 1984 at the same time too, which I'd like to point out. So
yeah. you don't think the synths hurt it on the timeliness aspect? You think it transcends that?
Oddly enough, I don't, believe
Yeah.
it or not, and I think that's because for me it doesn't. It maybe it's because I've grown up listening to it my entire life, and
Right.
because synths still exist in popular music, and they kind of exist in some ways. They exist a little like what they sound like here, not totally, but I don't know. It doesn't seem as aged
Yeah.
to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I was just curious. Is this your favorite Van Halen album of the?
Oh, no. My favorite Van Halen album. I mean, it's hard to not say the first one isn't
Right.
the best Van Halen album. I also love Fair Warning is a Van Halen album I really like a lot. So it's maybe not as consistent as this one and one, but there's some really great tracks on that. And Van Halen 2 is an underappreciated album too. It's basically, it's kind of like, how Boston and Boston's follow-up are pretty much the same album, but
Yeah.
if you kind of listen to them together, you get like this incredible like 16-song album when you put the pieces together. But yeah, I'd still say probably one is my favorite Van Halen album, but this one certainly has a lot of sentimental value for me because myself and a couple friends of mine from high school, like this was a go-to jam, whenever we had to, we were getting set for the stage, all the way down to like, when we decided to do Airband Follies in high school, right? Like the first song we knew we were going to do was going to be Jump, because we were going to try to dress up like them in the video, because the Jump video is hilarious. So like, it's all right, let's see if we can find the jackets, and somebody's going to dress in that weird like 80s outfit that Mike Anthony has on, and I'm going to look for like fishnets and stuff, and just, yeah, it was kind of perfect. So it was the first thing that came to mind. Yeah.
I find it really interesting that Eddie Van Halen, for as much of the guitar virtuoso and rocking guy as he is, was the driving force behind the synths. It's like, let's have my guitar fade a little bit and let's bring the synths
Well, but
up.
remember,
like,
he fashioned himself as a classical musician to some degree.
Yeah.
Like he viewed the guitar more as like a means to an end, right? As opposed to, I think he liked the rock and roll lifestyle at the beginning as much as he liked necessarily. Yeah. And then,
but still, that's really interesting that but he still is he is, for a lot of people, the guitarist, right? The guitar guy.
Right.
And even the guitar guys like, I'm going to kind of, going to put that aside a little bit and go in this other direction. Yes, he's got the classical, interest, and it probably speaks to his overall musicianship and just interest in a variety of things. But yeah, you don't expect the guy that's like the perfectionist the perfect version of the guitar, like going in that direction. It's just,
but he's a tinkerer too. So when
Yeah.
you think of what the synth is, the synth is a tinkerer's. You think of all the people we met who loved the synth, right? Like Kate Bush and Kraftwerk and Prince. All these people that Rush, that like to mess around with the synth, right? These are all people that are like known tinkerers. So if you think of Eddie Van Halen as a born tinkerer, like guy who builds his own guitar, messes around, like, it does fit in some ways.
Yeah.
So
Is this the last Van Halen we're covering, I think?
this is the last Van Halen album. That
No-
we're
no Van
currently
Hagar,
covering. No Van Hagar. OU812, you mean? Like stuff like that? Yeah.
OU 812 5150. For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge, the only Van Halen album I ever bought.
That's depressing on a number of fronts. Yeah.
Come on, man. It had Pound Cake on it.
I will say, though, that the 2012 album was surprisingly good. A different kind of truth. So, I mean, it's not vintage, but I think you'll be surprised that it's a much better album than you think it would be for an older band. So, yep. And they're a great live band. I wish I had seen them in their peak. I only saw them later. But like, if I were to make a list of top 5 concerts of an era that you could transport me to, like seeing Van Halen in like the era of like 1977 to 1982 would be in my top 5 for sure.
Yeah.
Right up there with like Stones in 1968-ish, 67, 68-ish would be in that. You guys want to throw any others in that would be fun to see?
Well, my go-to is always seeing Guns N' Roses when they're
Okay.
with the Appetite.
Oh yeah.
That would be awesome.
In like LA at like the Whiskey
Yeah.
A Go Go or something like in '86. I think seeing Kiss as a teenager in like 1974 would be pretty mind blowing too in that era. Like when they're busting out Strutter and Deuce and stuff, and they're dressing up and spitting blood and shit. Like that would probably be a pretty damn cool concert.
I've always wanted to see Wu-Tang in their prime with all of them up on stage. That would have been awesome too.
Some of those, like I to see like the Clash in that era when like just around London, it's like you could get into a brawl at any time would be kind of cool as well. I feel like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
So, Matt, you have any that you'd like to throw in?
I like the Guns N' Roses one, Josh.
Yeah.
I'd say the Beatles would just be people that's not a good show. You know what I mean? Like that wouldn't really be terribly
I don't think of them
appealing.
as like a live I mean, they were a good
No.
live bit when you see them, but yeah, I don't know if it's like I have bands I love, but I wouldn't put them in the like I need to see them in concert tier.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of like some of my favorite acts, like who I would want to see. I don't know.
It
I'll
would
have to
be
think
pretty
about that.
mind blowing to see like Metallica in 1985 or something too. I think
Yeah.
would be pretty incredible. Or like Iron Maiden in 1983, like Number of the Beast era. Like Iron Maiden would be pretty incredible too. So there's a few. Yeah. So